How does a regional war push global oil above $100 a barrel in a matter of days, erase roughly 20 million barrels of supply from daily markets, rattle stock exchanges from Tokyo to New York, and then suddenly reverse course almost overnight? The shock moving through energy markets is not only about bombs or tankers, it is about a narrow waterway, a chain of political decisions, and the fragile mechanics that keep the global economy fueled. In recent days, military escalation around Iran and the Strait of Hormuz triggered one of the sharpest energy shocks in years. Oil surged past $100 a barrel as markets feared that a critical artery of global trade had been severed. But the story did not end there. After days of volatility and escalating military rhetoric, oil markets abruptly shifted direction when the President of the United States, Donald Trump, signaled that the conflict with Iran was nearing its conclusion. Prices that had surged beyond crisis levels quickly dropped to roughly $85 per barrel. What unfolded illustrates how modern energy markets react not only to military events on the ground, but also to political signals about how long a war might last. If the confrontation widens, the consequences extend far beyond the Middle East. About 1/5 of the world's traded oil normally passes through the Strait of Hormuz, and disruptions there immediately affect refinery schedules, shipping insurance, and consumer fuel prices. When Brent crude jumps past $100 for the first time since 2022, and US benchmark West Texas Intermediate climbs even higher, the signal to markets is simple. The supply buffer that stabilizes the modern economy is shrinking. To understand why this matters, you have to look at how the Gulf energy system evolved. Since the 1970s oil shocks, global supply chains have relied on concentrated production in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates. Tankers leaving these exporters funnel through Hormuz, a channel barely 30 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. That geography gives any regional confrontation disproportionate economic power because even temporary blockages can remove millions of barrels per day from circulation. In the latest escalation, strikes around Tehran reportedly hit several energy-related facilities, while regional security risks pushed shipping companies to halt transit through the strait. Analysts estimate that as much as 20 million barrels per day of crude and condensate have effectively been delayed or stranded. Futures markets reacted immediately. Brent rose more than 16% at the opening of Asian trading to roughly $108 per barrel, while West Texas Intermediate surged close to 20%. Equity markets responded with sharp declines. Japan's Nikkei 225 dropped more than 6% during early trading. South Korea's Kospi lost nearly the same magnitude, and Australia's ASX 200 slid close to 4%. Political messaging from Washington attempted to frame the price spike as a temporary cost tied to eliminating long-term security threats, signaling that policymakers were willing to tolerate short-term volatility if strategic objectives were achieved. Iranian military messaging, meanwhile, emphasized the opposite leverage. Officials linked continued attacks with the possibility of dramatically higher oil prices and warned that vessels attempting to cross the strait could face direct threats. Hundreds of tankers consequently paused routes, while storage terminals in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait reportedly approached operational limits because exports were slowing faster than production. Energy analysts describe the situation as a sudden imbalance between seaborne logistics and upstream output. Oil fields across the Gulf can continue pumping, yet without secure tanker lanes, the crude accumulates in storage or must be shut in. Shutting wells is technically complex and financially damaging, which is why even temporary maritime risk creates outsized price reactions in futures markets. What if the strait remains effectively closed for several weeks? Roughly 20% of globally traded oil and a significant share of liquefied natural gas would remain trapped inside the Gulf. Strategic petroleum reserves in the United States, China, Europe, and Japan could soften the shock for a limited period, but sustained disruption would likely drive prices toward the $150 range projected by some Gulf officials. Another scenario moves in the opposite direction. If diplomatic pressure or military deterrence restores shipping security and insurers again cover tanker routes, the backlog of stored crude could quickly return to the market. In that case, prices might retreat sharply, yet volatility would remain because traders would remember how rapidly the system moved from apparent stability to severe shortage. Energy shocks rarely remain confined to the Gulf. Import-dependent economies across Asia feel the pressure first. India, which imports roughly 85% of its crude consumption, faces particular exposure. Critics inside the country argue that policy missteps by the government of Narendra Modi have amplified vulnerability by allowing strategic reserves to remain limited relative to demand growth and by maintaining heavy reliance on maritime routes that converge near Hormuz. Supporters of the administration dispute that assessment and point to diversified purchasing from Russia and the Middle East since 2022. Yet the debate itself illustrates how energy security quickly becomes political when price spikes hit households and industries simultaneously. Similar pressures are emerging in Europe and East Asia, where governments must balance sanctions policy, alliance commitments, and domestic inflation risks. Shipping insurance markets provide another critical mechanism. When insurers classify a waterway as a high-risk war zone, premiums surge or coverage disappears entirely. Tanker operators then refuse voyages regardless of oil prices because a single missile or naval mine could destroy a vessel worth more than $100 million. That feedback loop explains why even limited military threats can immobilize hundreds of ships simultaneously. Behind the price charts lies a deeper strategic contest. Control over energy transit routes has shaped power politics for decades, from the tanker wars of the 1980s to modern naval patrols in the Gulf. The present confrontation again demonstrates that geography, alliances, and deterrence remain tightly connected to economic stability. Financial markets react within minutes, but the political calculations unfold over months. History shows that energy markets punish complacency. When supply chains narrow to a few choke points, political miscalculation anywhere along that corridor can echo through every economy on Earth. The coming weeks will test whether deterrence, diplomacy, and market adaptation can reopen the flow through Hormuz, or whether strategic rivalry keeps the world's most important oil gateway under persistent threat. Behind the price charts lies a deeper strategic contest. Control over energy transit routes has shaped power politics for decades, from the tanker wars of the 1980s to modern naval patrols in the Gulf. The present confrontation again demonstrated that geography, alliances, and deterrence remain tightly connected to economic stability. Financial markets react within minutes, but the political calculations unfold over months. During the peak of the crisis, Gulf countries were reportedly forced to reduce production or temporarily shut down some refinery operations after Iranian missile strikes targeted US military bases across the region. The retaliation heightened fears that the conflict could spiral into a full regional war, cutting off one of the world's most important energy corridors. For several days, markets behaved as though the worst-case scenario was approaching, with traders pricing in the possibility of sustained disruptions to global oil supply. But then the narrative shifted. After days of escalation, President Donald Trump publicly indicated that the war with Iran was almost over, signaling that the conflict had largely achieved its objectives and was nearing conclusion. Markets reacted immediately. Oil prices that had climbed past $100 per barrel fell roughly 6% within hours, stabilizing near $85 as traders recalculated the likelihood of prolonged disruption. Tankers began cautiously resuming transit through the Strait of Hormuz, and some of the backlog of crude trapped inside the Gulf started moving again. Yet the episode leaves an important lesson for the global economy. The modern energy system runs through a handful of geographic choke points and political decisions made by a small number of governments. A single military escalation can send prices soaring. A single political signal can send them falling again. The question now is not only whether the immediate war is ending, but whether the underlying tensions that triggered the crisis have truly disappeared, or whether the world's most important oil gateway will remain a pressure point waiting for the next shock.